In this video, I will help you navigate a CE marking directive, in this case the EMC directive, to help you understand how these directives and regulations that mandate CE marking are, let's say, structured. And this will, well, help you understand the underlying requirements and also help you navigate these regulations and directives on your own. So here I am on the EU law database, Eurolex. And before we begin, we have to make sure that we select the latest consolidated versions. EU regulations and directives mandating CE marking, they are subject to amendments, meaning that there could be future versions not available at the time of recording for any regulation or directive. So you have to pick the latest version down here, okay? Right, now we have the latest version, which is from 2018. And we begin with Article 1. What you will find in many of these regulations and directives is something called a subject matter. This essentially describes what this regulation or directive is about. And in this case, it makes it clear that this directive regulates electromagnetic compatibility to ensure it doesn't interfere with other equipment and so on. Okay? You have different reasons for other regulations and directives to exist. Some could regulate toy safety, others could regulate certain heavy metals and chemicals. Others may relate to electrical safety, medical device safety, and so on. Article 2, scope. Now bear in mind that the scope is not necessarily always under Article 2. Just want to be clear about that. It's under Article 2 in the EMC directive specifically. Anyway, now, most of these regulations, though, they do have a scope, and it is in the scope that we find information about the product or the products or the categories that are covered by this regulation, basically telling us what products the regulation or directive applies to. So this is really important. And here it says that this directive shall apply to equipment defined in Article 3. I have to go down to Article 3, and we have to find a definition of equipment, which we find down here. Means any apparatus or fixed installation. Essentially, the EMC directive applies to all electronics. We can put it that way. But some are more specific. Some may apply specifically to toys, or which has its own definition, or medical devices, or protective equipment, or electronics within a certain voltage range. So it's really important to read the scope. Now, in the scope, you can also find exemptions. Okay, that's another important part, telling us what the regulation or directive does not apply to. Okay, let's move on. Now, I already touched upon this, but here you can find definitions. And you don't necessarily have to be concerned with every single one of these, but there are two that are of particular importance, and that is the definition of a manufacturer and a definition of an importer. Now, it's very important that if you import or manufacture or contract products that require CE marking, the first step is to actually determine if you are a manufacturer or an importer. Now, a manufacturer could indeed be the factory of the product, but it can also be a company that has products designed or manufactured, meaning that if I take an electronic product and I design it, or I just order it from a contract manufacturer, say in Shenzhen in China, well, then I could be the manufacturer because I had it manufactured. And I had it maybe even designed. And companies that market products under their trade name, okay? So there are many scenarios in which a company that's basically just someone with a laptop could actually be defined as a manufacturer. And this is important because this means that you thus assume the responsibilities of a manufacturer. Now, the other one I want to highlight is the definition of an importer. Now, this refers to any entity that is established in the EU and is basically selling products from a country outside the EU. Now, it's important here that an importer by definition can only be based in the EU in most cases. Okay, so this means that only an EU company can be defined as an importer. Manufacturer is different. The manufacturer is not necessarily based in the EU. It could be based in China, the UK, the US. So it's a difference between these two. And I will explain why this matters in a bit. Let's scroll down. Under essential requirements, you can find, let's say, more or less extensive, let's say, high-level let's say, definitions or requirements that a product must meet, but which is then referred to in Annex 1 in this specific case. Now, let's go to have a look at obligations of manufacturers. This is really a key article that you will find in most regulations and directives and mandates CE marking. In a way, obligations of manufacturers, this is really the engine room of the regulation, or directive in this case. And the reason is that the manufacturer is generally the party that is responsible for actively managing compliance, for actively CE marking the product and all that comes with that. In practice, this can be a matter of drawing up technical documentation, maintaining technical documentation, creating a declaration of conformity, and affixing the CE mark. Making sure that you have certain label information as specified here concerning the product, and also the manufacturer name and address. These articles you will see in different variations in many regulations and directives mandating CE marking, that you have to provide instructions, printed instructions in most cases. Managing recalls. Okay, so this is what you'll find in obligations of manufacturers. It's really important that you read the obligations of manufacturers article to understand what you must do in practice. So this is really the beating heart or the engine room of the regulation. This is in many ways decides what you as a manufacturer must do. And then we have the other side of the coin, the obligations of the importer. If the manufacturer is the active party, then the importer is responsible for checking documentation, basically where the manufacturer creates a declaration of conformity and arranges testing. The importer has to request a declaration of conformity and make sure that it has all the information required. Obtain the test report and assess that it's correct. Technical documentation, user instructions, and so on. Two sides of the same coin. But it's very important you read the obligations of importers if you are defined as an importer. You can also find obligations of distributors, essentially only relevant to companies buying goods from other EU manufacturers or EU importers. And as you can see, the obligations tend to be less extensive. Okay, now what else do we have? A key concept that you will find in most, if not all, CE marking regulations and directives is that of the presumption of conformity. And whereas these regulations and directives, they generally provide high-level requirements and documentation requirements, labeling requirements, they do not necessarily, usually, they don't tell me what do I need to do in order to make sure that my product is compliant, and my product is safe, and my product meets the requirements. Now, for EMC, this can be a matter of shielding and so on to make sure that it doesn't interfere with other equipment. For toys, that could be making sure it doesn't contain certain chemicals, or it doesn't have small parts or sharp points. Medical devices, well, of course, that can be even more complicated. But in short, product doesn't become magically compliant. And where do we then find the information? Like, how do we find the pathways? Well, that's not found generally in the legislation text. Instead, we have to look for harmonized standards. And what this is saying, the concept of presumption of conformity, is that if you are selling a product, and that product is then compliant with harmonized standards, then you have achieved the objective of the regulation or directive that applies. Okay, so high level we have regulation and directives, and these then lists harmonized standards, and you must identify the standards for your product and make sure that you adjust your design drawings and so on and arrange testing. Okay, so basically your product is presumed to comply if it complies with harmonized standards. That's the concept. This is a concept you will find in majority of these regulations. Then there's also the concept of the conformity assessment. And a conformity assessment is essentially, it's a set of procedures that I must complete in order to fulfill my obligations as a manufacturer and make sure that my product is compliant. And in some cases, you can do something that's called internal production control. That's module A is often known as module A. And what internal production control means is that I, as a manufacturer, I identify the standards, I create documentation, label files, instructions, and so on and so forth. And I come to the conclusion entirely on my own, and of course based on a test report, that my product is not compliant. And there's no external oversight in this scenario. Okay? And whether that is allowed tend to depend on certain conditions. In some cases, it's the default option. It could be the case that it's only allowed if you use harmonized standards, if your product belongs to a certain device class or category. And in other cases, let's say I'm not following a harmonized standard, or my product belongs to a high risk class or risk category. In that case, I may need to follow a different conformity assessment procedure that involves a notified body. We do have a separate tutorial that goes into more detail when it comes to conformity assessment procedures and the involvement of notified bodies. In Article 15, this makes it clear that a manufacturer needs to create a declaration of conformity based on the module that is provided. You can find in Annex 4. I will show you that in a bit. You can very often find requirements concerning the affixing of the CE mark, and basically states that the CE mark must be applied to the product, and when this is not possible, the packaging or accompanying documentation like user instructions, but very often affixing the CE mark to the product is the default option. Okay. Okay, so these are all specific to the EMC directive, and that's not what I would go into in this case. Then, of course, you do have a lot of requirements that don't relate to manufacturers and importers, but member states or have notified bodies would operate and so on, which is not relevant unless you are operating as a notified body, but that's not what this course is about. So I'm going to skip these articles. And I'm going to go straight down to the annexes. And at the very bottom of most CE marking regulations and directives, you'll find a series of annexes, and these are very often referenced in other articles. And what these mean, the purpose of these is that they do contain information. Could be information about, say, safety requirements, or in this case, the requirements that must be fulfilled under certain conformity assessment procedures. You may be able to find, in many cases you will also find the templates that must be used for declaration of conformity files. Okay, so that can often be found in the annex section. Technical documentation requirements can often be found in annexes too. You can see that right here. Right. So this is it. This is the entirety of the latest version at the time of recording of the EMC directive. You have a scope, you have definitions, you have obligations for manufacturers and importers, and annexes where you find specific information and must be in certain documentation, labeling, and so on and so forth. And this is what a CE marking regulation and directive can look like. They all differ, of course, but they tend to follow a very similar structure.